Hello and welcome to Mehta-Ethics. I'm very happy to announce that we finally hit 500 subscribers, so in celebration, let's do a Q&A. Now, a lot of these topics are quite deep and really deserve a whole video to themselves, but I'll do my best to provide as much clarity as I can in a reasonable time. The first question comes from Lawrence Anton, who writes, "What do you think are the extent of our duties as individuals to help others? To give you a specific example to bite into, how much aid should we give to those in need, human and non-human?" Well, to address the latter part first, if we have duties, then I think non-humans should be given the same treatment as trait-adjusted humans. That is, if we're obliged to help a human with the sentience of a cow who's in need, then we're obliged to help a cow in need. This is entailed within my conception of veganism. As to what the extent of our duties are, this is very hard to talk about in exact terms, but I'll say that I would consider it obligatory, meaning wrong not to do so, to help someone in need if the cost to yourself is extremely insignificant or massively outweighed by the benefit brought about. But past some point of higher self-cost or reduced benefit, I would only consider it supererogatory, meaning a nice thing to do, but not wrong not to do so. More practically, I think most people in the Western world should give some money to a beneficial cause, and I personally do so despite not having a great deal of money. Determining how much they should give is a much more difficult task and would require a lot of thought. If you'd like to see a video discussing this, then let me know in the comments. Mark Ross writes, "If violating the rights of non-human sentient beings for animal products is immoral, why isn't violating the rights of non-human sentient beings for crop production immoral? As a new vegan, I'm not entirely sure how to approach these types of questions." Well, I don't think it is the case that we're violating the rights of non-human sentient beings for crop production because I don't grant rights to beings who are trying to destroy crops. This is just like if a neighboring country invaded and started attacking our food supply. Most likely the military would get involved and kill them. There have been a couple of times where I've run Name the Trait on people and said what's true of a cow that if true of a human would justify killing the human for food. And sometimes they've turned it around on me and said, what about crop deaths? To them I've just said, those animals have traits such that if they were true of a human, I would be okay with killing that human. These include traits like destroying my food or property and being unable to be reasoned with. And don't forget that many of these beings killed in crop production may not even be sentient at all. Another question from Mark Ross. "Do you think it's moral for welders to buy and use leather personal protective equipment? A lot of welders work on stuff that basically keeps our society functioning. There's a shortage of qualified welders, and if the currently employed welders didn't use leather PPE, the shortage would get worse as a result of injuries that harm their ability to work. I want to add that there are no equally protective alternatives to leather PPE as of this moment." Well, starting with using, in most cases I don't think it's wrong to use leather you already own because it's purchasing that direct money towards the animal agriculture industry. But to address buying, I'll start by pointing out that it doesn't seem to be the case that leather PPE is the only option. There are other materials available such as Kevlar, and I was able to find some non-leather PPE options like these ones. So if vegan options like those are a possibility for you, then I think you should choose them when buying PPE. However, if we just stipulate that it is the case that leather is the only option, things get a bit more complex. We can look at this on an individual level, where you're in a job and your employer mandates leather, or on a societal level, where it's either we have welders who use leather, or we don't have welders at all. On an individual level, I'd recommend getting vegan welding gloves and then just lying. Like when I was in high school, black leather shoes were mandatory for certain subjects, but I never wore them. Or if that's a risk you can't take, then trying to get second-hand leather PPE. But failing that, I generally think that some level of harm to animals is justified in order to prevent a sufficiently greater harm to yourself. Is buying one pair of leather gloves worth not being homeless? You could say yes and be consistent, so long as you'd also buy human leather gloves from a trait equalized human. And since you specifically asked about whether I think it's moral, I'd probably say it is. The relevant traits here would be something like already being involved in a system of mass exploitation by which your employer is forcing you to participate in or face living on the streets. Now, if we scale this up, like you were also mandated to eat meals containing animal products, then of course, at some point, the moral thing to do would be to change jobs, or past a certain point, even be homeless. But I'm not convinced that having to purchase one pair of leather gloves warrants that if there's no easy alternative. On a societal level, if our whole society were going to collapse without welders, then I think it would be justified for them to continue welding even if that meant they bought leather gloves. The benefit easily outweighs the harm. But back to reality, of course welders should transition to vegan alternatives. It's certainly not the case that we don't have non-leather PPE. Even if we didn't, technological progress is such that soon we'll just be able to grow it in a lab. Heartborn writes, what are your top 3 reasons for and against anti-natalism? Sure thing, I'll give my top 3 reasons for either side and a brief explanation. So the first reason for anti-natalism is actually opportunity cost. So essentially, even low estimates for the price of raising a child in Australia are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. There is so much good that could be done with this money instead of having a child. The second is the axiological asymmetry, though I think I conceive of this quite differently to David Benatar. I don't think there is a reason for people to be committed to thinking that having been brought into existence is always bad. However, it could be reasonable to think so, even if your life is very good. And I'm not even convinced there's much of a likelihood that my child's life would be very good. Where I'm at with this is that if I had a child and it would rather have not been born, this would be so crushing, and I would feel so terrible for having brought them into existence. The third reason is just a preference against having children. For a considerable amount of time, since learning about anti-natalism and subsequently child-free culture, I've felt that raising children doesn't seem particularly appealing to me, so why would I do it? But what are my top 3 reasons against anti-natalism? Well, the first has got to be the argument from ecological niches. I talked about this in my video about when I met David Benatar. The argument essentially states that even if bringing beings into existence is always wrong, by having a child, especially in a developed country, you'll contribute to habitat destruction and therefore reduce the amount of non-human beings brought into existence. The second is just issues with the axiological asymmetry. As I just mentioned, I conceive of the asymmetry quite differently to Benatar. I actually think there are significant problems with how Benatar has formulated his asymmetry. These could be resolved, but I don't think the conclusion would then be that coming into existence is always a bad thing. More on this to come in a future video. And finally, a preference for having children or spreading my genes. While I've just said that having children doesn't seem particularly appealing to me, I do recognize that this preference could change in the future. Additionally, it may be the case that me being vegan and, I think, reasonably intelligent could be good reasons for me to spread my genes. If you want to think about this a little bit deeper, you can watch the movie Idiocracy. Seabass says, what are your thoughts on causal inefficacy in respect to veganism? And John Hadley's metalevel problem for animal rights theories, the triad problem. Well, I'm not convinced the inefficacy objection to veganism works. My position is that while we don't have loads of research, the research we do have implies that our consumer choices do have an impact on the animals even at an individual level. And here's a study to back that up. As for John Hadley's metalevel problem, I'd never heard of this until reading this comment. I'll do my best to recapitulate it now. He argues that animal rights theories face a dilemma when attempting to delineate which beings deserve rights and which don't. He presents 3 standard ways that vegans would presumably want their criteria, like sentience or rationality, to meet. However, says that we can only accept 2 of them at a time. These standards are 1. Consistency. The theory must be consistent in applying the criteria it uses to grant rights. 2. Non-arbitrariness. The criteria for rights must not be arbitrary or based on morally irrelevant features. And 3. Inclusivity. The theory must include all beings that intuitively deserve moral consideration. So, Hadley would argue that if we delineate beings who get rights based on rationality, then we're consistent, non-arbitrary, but fail to be inclusive because it would leave out non-rational beings such as babies or really most animals. If we use sentience, then we're consistent, inclusive, but arbitrary, because he thinks we don't have a way to define sentience in edge cases. If we use just being alive, then we're inclusive, non-arbitrary, but not consistent because there are plenty of living things we think it's fine to kill. Now, while I could just be misunderstanding it, and I'm happy for someone to correct me over a voice call, this honestly just seems like a total non-issue for 2 reasons. 1, I don't care about meeting all those standards, and 2, I have a criterion for granting rights that I'm happy with, non-trivial sentience. So to address the standards, I do care about being consistent, but I'm not convinced I should care about arbitrariness as it's described here. Honestly, arbitrariness always seems suspect to me whenever it's brought up as a critique of something. What exactly is a morally irrelevant feature? This seems to be implying something spooky. For any criterion someone has for granting rights, if it's genuinely what the person cares about and not completely random, then I would never attack it by saying it's arbitrary. In fact, if arbitrary just means personal preference, then I don't think there's a problem at all. Inclusivity also doesn't seem to matter to me beyond my own standard. What are beings that intuitively deserve moral consideration, if not just the beings that I care about extending moral consideration to? Once again, seems spooky. It could just mean the beings that vegans typically care about, but a lot of them care about oysters or certain bugs that I don't think matter. So, in order for me to care about meeting these standards, I would need more detail on what they are and potentially some motivation to actually care about them. So as I mentioned, the criterion I use for granting rights is non-trivial sentience. Hadley would say this is arbitrary, possibly because of edge cases. To this I'd respond that while yes, I can't be sure certain beings aren't sentient, I also can't be sure anybody I talk to is sentient, so 100% certainty doesn't matter to me. I go off if the beings have the necessary brain structure and whether they respond to certain stimuli. This information makes me confident enough to believe a being is or isn't sentient. If something seems in doubt, then I don't think there's an issue with just having a precautionary principle. Also, while I haven't thoroughly read it, while looking at Hadley's writing, I found an interesting quote. For proponents of animal rights theory, a point exists along the psychological complexity continuum above which direct value ceases to vary and moral status equalizes, yet below which the distribution of value remains variable. This is interesting to me because I just completely disagree with it. I think less sentient or less psychologically complex humans are less value than more sentient humans. So this makes me feel like Hadley and I hold very different views. And finally, Talus Per Se asks 3 questions. What do you think is the best argument for your favored meta-ethical view? Well, I'll start by saying that my favored meta-ethical view is anti-realism, but to go a layer deeper, I take a possibly uncommon view that subjectivism, error theory, and non-cognitivism are just contingent on empirical claims or differing definitions of what is meant when people use words like good and bad. So I want to be clear that I'm not making any claim about what other people mean when they talk about morality, only what I mean. And with that caveat, I think the best descriptor of my view is subjectivism, which I would just define as a conjunction of the following 3 propositions. Moral statements are truth-apt, at least one of them is true, and the truth maker of the statements is the dispositions of the speaker. When it comes to arguing for these three propositions, they seem trivially true since I just define moral statements, the ones I make, as expressions of my dispositions. Then the other two propositions are logically entailed because it can be true or untrue that I have a certain disposition, and it is the case that at least one of them is true. What's the most amount of soy milk you've drunk in a day? Well, I've definitely consumed more than 3 liters of soy milk in a day. For a while, I was doing what I affectionately referred to as GOSAD, gallon of soy a day. This was just an easy way to hit my protein and calorie goals, but I've since found far more reasonable alternatives. And lastly, do you know what topics you want to write and perform songs on next? I write music on whatever comes to mind, and I usually don't feel like I have a lot of control over this. Lyrics will just come to me on whatever topic, but I would like to write more songs explicitly about veganism. I already have some, they're just waiting to be recorded and released. In the meantime, you can check out the 2 songs I have released, Landlord Genocide and I Wish I Stayed in the Ballsack. So, that's the end of the Q&A. Thanks to everyone who submitted a question, and of course, everyone feel free to leave more questions for a future Q&A, or let me know what topics you'd like to see a video on. Thanks for watching.